Okay, yeah, my name's Jon Thackray. I was employed by Acorn in right at the beginning of 1982 after I'd finished an RA at Cambridge University, and basically they took me on to ultimately take over from Paul Bond, who was a consultant from Top Express doing the BBC operating system. He'd done the MOS 0.1, which had got out, and along with the Model A and Model B, and then it was my job to run parallel to him to start with, and step on his toes. More of that later, and eventually to take over from him, because whilst Acorn seemed to think it had loads of money, I don't think it wanted to pay the kind of consultancy fees that Top Express would have charged for Paul's time. But having consultants wasn't unusual for Acorn. I think they had quite a number of them from various places. Oh, look at that! It wasn't my first computer, but it was the first computer a friend of mine had, which is pretty odd at the time. I don't even remember the paper tape, but that looks like 8-hole paper tape rather than the 5-hole paper tape, which was also quite common at the time. I don't remember ever writing a program for it. I just remember that he had it, and he had it in his bedroom. But he was a bit of an electronics whiz, and his dad was a bit of an entrepreneur, and he was just a schoolmate of mine in the same class as me. We were both mathematicians, as much as we could be anything at that time, given that we were only 14 or 15. And then, as I said, in the sixth form, we actually got a chance to attempt to learn computer programming at the local tech, which then changed its name to Northeast Surrey College of Technology, and I think probably is now something or other university, much in the same way as CCAT has become Anglia Ruskin, for anybody who knows Cambridge. The Elliott 003 was a fabulous machine. It occupied a room with about the footprint of the ground floor of my house, and I believe, I'm not sure whether that's a paper tape reader I can see there on the left. It probably is. And when it was reading tape full speed, that tape would go about 20 feet into an enormous bin. And that was how it read its Algol compiler in. And then it basically just ran as a batch, reading in people's programs, compiling them and running them. And it was amazing. You could write reasonable Algol programs and it would run them, despite the fact that it probably ran, I don't know, at about a kilohertz, something like that. I mean, it was really slow. It had ferrite core memory, and it had this fabulous, das Computer is nicht for Dummkopfen, and Poppenflusen and Blowen Korken and all the blinking light stuff. That was the first time I ever saw that. And as I said, I tried writing a program to, after I'd written the standard sort of how to solve a quadratic equation or whatever. Thought, I know what, I'll program the school timetable. Nobody told me anything about order of algorithms at the time, and how this was non-polynomial and incredibly hard, and just like doing traveling salesman and all the rest of it. Anyway, I managed to get a kind of small prototype to work, but it never went very far. And then I went off to Cambridge to study maths. And Cambridge at the time had an IBM 370, and you could get a login on that if you wanted. And I think I did. And various friends of mine, I was lucky enough to live on a staircase with a bunch of guys who were in their third year. One of whom was a guy called Dave Collier, who later got a job working for Medge's dad, writing the first version of the word processor. Anyway, I chatted to him a lot, and he introduced me to people at the computing service, and I got a user ID and all the rest of it. And anyway, Medge suggested that I should write this tape loader. We didn't have an instruction manual as such. We had a copy of the predecessor machine and an addendum saying these are the new instructions, and we had the hexadecimal codes. So I had to write the whole lot of this. I basically got a very large piece of sort of large square graph paper and wrote it out in hex, you know, calculating all the branch destinations by hand and converting them into hexadecimal. And eventually I decided I'd write an emulator for it, and I've been writing emulators ever since. It's just one of those things that happened, and I was lucky enough to do that on the Cambridge University machine. Things were very open in those days. Anybody could log in as anybody else. Nobody bothered with passwords or anything else. And the whole new museum site didn't have locks on the doors. That didn't really start to happen until they got BBC computers in there and people started nicking them. You know, prior to that, all they had was these old green and amber screen or whatever teletypes, and that's even when they had screens. Prior to that, they had teletypes with reams and reams of paper, so nobody wanted to nick those. So of course they didn't need to lock the doors. Anyway, yeah, next.
Sorry, wrong way.
Yeah, that's okay. Anyway, yeah, so I got enough of a degree to allow me to do part 3 maths and then start a PhD. And my PhD was entitled Modular Representations of Sporadic Simple Groups. And if anybody understands any of the words in there other than of, they can ask me a question about it later. But anyway, I managed to do a bit of computing because the kind of problems I was trying to solve very rapidly became theoretically intractable, but they could be tracted by doing matrix multiplication, where the elements, rather than being real numbers or complex numbers, were actually noughts and ones, with the addition being exclusive OR and the multiplication being AND. Anyway, I bumped into Paul Bond, and he was doing a PhD there at the time, got to know him, and another buddy who knew Andy Hopper, which was jolly helpful later because that got me an interview with Andy. And Andy, by that stage, I think was the director of Acorn. And the other thing I did, as I said, probably on the next slide. Yes, here we go. So as I said, I wasted a lot of time solving Colossal Cave, which was one of the original adventure games, along with Zork. I never encountered Zork while I was a student. Other people knew about it. And I bumped into another guy in the maths department called David Seal, who was into that and also into D&D. I managed not to waste my time on D&D, otherwise I probably never have got a PhD. David never did. And then we did manage to waste our time writing a compiler and interpreter for this game, and then writing our own game. And then later on, we wrote another compiler and another interpreter and published it on the Beeb. After I'd gone to Acorn, I got David a job there, and he took over from Graham Tabby, who was the graphics guy. And the funniest thing about Graham was apparently he was doing the graphics despite being colorblind, but he still managed to do it. Okay, that's probably enough. So, yeah, so after doing my PhD, John Conway, who some of you may recognise as the inventor of the Game of Life, cellular automata game, very famous in the 60s and 70s and a very common programming project. He asked me to help them publish this book, The Atlas of Finite Groups, which is an enormous big red book. It's not the little red school book. This is the enormous red university book. It's about best part of 2 feet tall, and it's about 18 inches wide. And I happen to have a copy here, so I'm going to see if I can show it to you. So, yeah, there we go. This is the Atlas of Finite Groups. And there on it are the names of the authors. You can see there J.H. Conway, Bob Curtis you wouldn't recognise. Simon Norton you might have heard of. He was the subject of a book called The Genius in My Basement. And Richard Parker is mentioned later. And on the very first page, there is a reference right at the bottom saying I did the computing work. So there you go. So that was my 18 months in the pure maths department, and then I was looking for a job, and it was about the time that Acorn had got the Beeb contract and had produced the Model A and Model B. And I managed to talk to Andy Hopper, via my mate who'd had him for lectures. That got me a chat to Herman, who by then had Paul Bond, who said, yes, I would be a good guy to have. And that was how I got the job working at Acorn, and we were working in the water softening station at the time. So I think it's probably time to go on. Yeah. So at that time, the software for the MOS and everything else was all written in 6502 assembler. We did the assembly of it using these System 3s that Paul's managed to get a picture of. And it was all held on floppy disks. I think to begin with, we probably had two single-sided 40s, and later, eventually, we managed to get to 2 double-sided 80s. And we had terrible trouble with those 5 1/4 floppies. Everyone needed to be formatted. It was not unusual to get a box of 10 and find 2 of them failed, and they probably had a shelf life of maybe 6 months or a year, something like that, after which you basically had to have thrown them away. So you got seriously used to doing backups. And some particular brands, as I've mentioned, Mr. Wabash, which the purchasing department thought were great because they were dirt cheap, but actually, they were dirt cheap because they were dirt rubbish. So I think that's probably all for that slide. So, yeah, the first assembler I wrote wasn't actually MASM, although Paul's quoted it as MASM. MASM didn't occur until we had the second processor, but I did rewrite the original assembler because the 2 versions weren't very good. We had an awful lot of difficulty basically assembling the entire BBC MOS in a single 6502 and its 64K of memory. Anyway, we got it to work, and I gradually took over from Paul. I spent enormous amounts of time basically crawling through the code, looking for places where we could make it shorter, because we were always short of space to put something or other in that somebody wanted. So there was never a sort of, let's go and rewrite all this from scratch. There was an enormous amount of gradual evolution, of shrinking, proving that it still worked, and then putting something else in, whatever that happened to be. I'm just going to consult my notes in case Paul's left anything out. Yeah, so anyway, eventually we managed to fix all the bugs that were in MOS 0.1. We thought we'd made MOS 1.0, which was what we were going to produce. We did produce ROMs of that, but we soon found that that wasn't good enough, and MOS 1.1 came along, and that wasn't good enough. We eventually got to MOS 1.2, and there are still bugs in that, but we've basically concluded they're not significant enough to fix. So that's where we stopped. And at that point, Acorn, as I said, realized that there was obviously an opportunity for a cheaper version in some sense, but not of the Model A variety, because the trouble with the Model A was it couldn't even do the big screen modes. So instead, the idea of the Electron was born. Now, the BBC computer used to run its RAMs pretty quickly. They would run at 4 megahertz, which in those days was fast. 2 megahertz of that was dedicated to the screen, and the other 2 megahertz of that was dedicated to the processor. So that basically meant that the processor could run full speed 2 megahertz all the time. For the Electron, with the ULA and all the rest of it, we basically toned that down to 2 megahertz, 1 megahertz available to the processor and 1 megahertz to the screen. Unfortunately, that's not fast enough to do things like mode 0 up to mode 3, because when they're going, they need 2 megahertz. So basically, at that point, the CPU would get locked out for about 40 microseconds out of every 64 on display line. So there'd be a portion of the time at the top of the screen and a portion of the time at the bottom of the screen when the CPU could run at its full 1 meg, and a bit of time off the sides on the left and the right when it could run at that, and then the rest of the time it was just locked while the screen took over. But the really big problem with the Electron was the ULA. So part of making it cheaper was to give up having all these discretes in it, like 6522s and 6854s and goodness knows what else. I think there was a Motorola UART in there as well. So all this was going to be put in the ULA. And unfortunately, we didn't have any design tools. So there was no simulation tools, really. We just had to get the thing right. There were no real synthesis tools to say, that, you're going to have clock problems there. That's too long a path. There was no clock domain crossing checking, for anybody who doesn't know what CDC is. So all the sort of things you expect to find in design tools for chip production today just didn't exist. Instead of which, all we had was this large basic program to do the layout, written by Roger. And unfortunately, what we didn't realise as well was that Ferranti really didn't understand their own technology, so they couldn't tell us anything about the path delays of things or anything else. And interestingly, we got the first version of this out, and we discovered that the RAMs were wired up back to front. The bottom half byte was wired to the top half, and vice versa. And Steve Ferber did an amazing job debugging all of this lot, getting it to work. And this is when I kind of invented, we had no software debugging tools at all. So the only way you could really debug this was you would set a point at which you turned on the caps lock light and basically probably put the thing into an infinite loop, and then you'd run it. And if the caps lock light turned on, you knew it had got that far, and you would then go and move your caps lock light point further into the code, and you'd erase the PROM, or hopefully have 3 or 4 PROMs that you were using, programmable read-only memories, which required UV light erasing and used to take about 10 minutes to erase. So you'd have a load of those that you could erase, reprogram, and stick another one in, and see if the caps lock light turned on. And if it did, great, you'd move it on further. And if it didn't, well, you'd binary chop until you got to the point where it did. And this was about it, and this is basically what people do nowadays with PIOs and oscilloscopes. So we did have oscilloscopes, but didn't have any PIOs, and the only light we had was a caps lock. Anyway, unfortunately, the ULA took an enormous amount of spins to get right. We had terrible trouble with things like the RAM timing, what have you, to get the setups and holds and razzes and cazzes. We went around 6 iterations of it, and it wasn't just that. There were things like you'd stick a tape in a van to go to Manchester where Ferranti was, and it wouldn't arrive. Somehow or other, the van would get lost somewhere between Cambridge and Manchester. How this happened, nobody really knows. I mean, if you believe in the Bermuda Triangle, you'd think there was one on the M6. But all sorts of things like that happened. Anyway, also, we were very worried that people would get hold of the code and start doing things. So we used to, instead of saying, Electron MOS, it had lots and lots of funny startup messages. And one of them, as I say, was an electric elk called Simon, which was a reference to the Monty Python sketch about Neville Shunt. For anyone who remembers it, it was Terry Jones with a silly bobble hat on, writing stupid sketches about railway timetables. Okay, I think we can move on. We were still, of course, making the Beeb at that time, but then the RAM supplier said, well, we're not going to make these 16K by 4s anymore. Of course, we had 8 of those to make up our 32K, and they said, well, the only things we've got now are 64K by 1s. And it's quite obvious you can't make a single cycle access RAM out of 4 of those. So we basically had to extend the memory to 64K, at which point we came up with the idea that we could have screen memory be separate from the program memory, so everybody would have the full 32K, whatever mode they were in, which is really nice. And I think we even managed to make the other 12K bytes available to them somehow or other, but I don't remember this. The other thing that I forgot to mention in here that was also going on was we tried to make an American version of this. As far as I can tell, this basically suffered exactly the same fate as most companies in the UK who try and branch out into America. They get hold of a load of people in the States who think they're on a gravy train and do loads of jet setting around the world to have important meetings, but nothing ever goes anywhere. But we spent, loads of time, dealing with the fact that the video in the UK was PAL and the video in the United States was NTSC, and it ran at a different refresh rate. But ultimately, that project was just closed. It never went anywhere. Anyway, that's my recollection of those bits. And has anybody already done the broken break instruction? Because I have a sneaking suspicion Hugo might have talked about this.
No,
I did not, because we discussed it in advance.
Oh, okay. Well done, Huge. Yeah.
That's
Can you remember how we fixed it?
Say again?
Can you remember how we fixed it? Because we discussed that. And neither of us
Yeah,
could
no,
remember.
I can't remember how we fixed it. As you say, it must have been in the NMI handler not the brake handler. But I agree with you. But that's all. I don't really remember it for myself. I remember the things that we discussed briefly in email being entirely plausible, but that's all. So over to you. I'm muting now.
Okie dokie. Yeah. So I don't know what the original purpose of the brake instruction was on the 6502, but basically it was a 2-byte instruction. The first byte was 0, and the second byte was a code of some sort, and it was meant to, I guess the idea was this was a software interrupt, enter the OS, do something or other, you know, in the same kind of way that an ARM had an SWI. But to be honest, for a 6502, that was way over the top. Anyway, I don't know whether the BBC machine was the first one to use break as its error message. I can well imagine that probably was history from System 3s, Atoms, whatever. So we used that, and after the break, we put a code, which was going to be the instruction code, you know, a bit like Erno. Unfortunately, from time to time, the Ethernet would come along with what was called, I think, an idle interrupt. And we had no real way of knowing when that was going to happen, because it was just a matter of the line going idle. And that would cause an NMI. And if the NMI happened to occur while the break was trying to happen, rather than simply wait for the next instruction boundary, it would happen in the middle. And that would have been fine, except that when the BRK was restarted, it was restarted 1 byte later, which basically meant that instead of the 0 being executed and being a BRK, the error message or the error code was executed, which might have been almost anything. Following that, the error string, which was in line and terminated with a 0, was then executed. And I'm pretty sure that by the time we were finding this, we were using CMOS processors where unknown instructions were NOPs, because on the NMOS processors that we'd had originally, unknown instructions would just lock, and this would have been catastrophic. As it was just embarrassing, because what would happen was some kind of random rubbish, but then we terminated the error string with a 0, and if we were lucky, that 0 was executed as a break, except that wasn't a break, and therefore the code after it wasn't an error code, and the stuff after that was the instructions to be executed after the break, or possibly even somewhere else. And that came out as the error code, which means it was typically full of top bit set characters and all sorts of stuff. So all kinds of rubbish would appear on the screen. Anyway, my recollection of this is ringing up these guys in Rockwell saying, you know, can I speak to somebody in technical? We think we found a bug in the 6502. And I eventually did get through to somebody who knew about this, and all I got was this sort of drawly Californian American on the other end of the phone saying, oh yeah, we know about that. I'm thinking, what? Why didn't you tell us? Anyway, and as Hugo says, I cannot remember what we did about it. I'm pretty sure we must have done something. We did fix most of the awful bugs like this.
It's possible that what we did was make every break instruction have a 0 immediately after it, and the break handler just skip over all the zeros. Because if you go break 0 error code text, you could deal with that in the handler. Anyway, enough from me.
Yeah, that might. I mean, we might have done that, because yeah, then if you restarted on the 0, you'd say, yep, that's okay. Yep, that might well have worked. Well, there you go, Huge. You can rewrite the MOS if you want, or rewrite BASIC more likely. Yeah. Anyway, so later still, I think 83, 84 probably, we realised that the BBC was running out of steam, and we needed an extension. And this was before Herman had been off to the States and discovered RISC and all the rest of it. But we were starting to face competition from IBM PCs and other people coming along and saying, you know, this is the obvious machine. It's the industry standard because it's IBM. Thinking, really? Anyway, so this was a much bigger machine. It had the same RAM idea of a separate screen area. And it had this fabulous RTC in it, real-time clock, and a small amount of non-volatile memory. And the idea of the non-volatile memory was you could store configuration stuff in it, like, you know, your auto repeat rate for the keyboard and your delay before auto repeating, and those kind of things. Unfortunately, in order for the NVMem to remain NV, it needed a battery, and the battery needed a charger. And someone who shall remain nameless wrote the charging for it, but they screwed up. And as a consequence, sometimes these things just never stop charging. Now, anybody who's looked at battery charging in any form of consumer device knows perfectly well that if you charge things forever, they get very hot. And if you keep charging them, they catch fire. And this is exactly what happened to one of our masters, and it did it in a hospital. We had a terrible, terrible time over that. I suspect the PR department probably worked, weeks without sleep to try and get around that one. And I believe we probably had to do some serious hardware redesign to fix that, and probably tell them, to turn the thing off at night. But of course, they were using these things to control experiments and things. They wanted them on 24/7. Anyway, the master was eventually produced. I think it had a lot more capability, if my memory serves me well, for putting in application ROMs, for word processors and all sorts of other funny things. But memory has faded a bit of this, and Master 128, maybe it even had more memory. I can't remember. Sorry.
John, it had an extra 64K, but that was in 16K chunks as parallel with the sideways ROMs.
Okay.
What they did with it. Yeah.
Oh, well. Anyway. Yeah, the tube, that was an interesting one. It turned out, you might remember me mentioning my buddy who got me an interview with Andy Hopper. There's a guy called Tony Mann, actually, and he worked for Acorn for a short while before going off and working for QDOS with Andy Hopper. QDOS stood for Quick Design on Silicon. Anyway, the job he got was laying out the tube, which, again, was done with Roger's fantastic software. Fortunately, the tube was much less critical to our general progress, unlike the Electron ULA, and we did manage to get it to work, but it didn't stop him having nightmares about it. He told me about one of them where he apparently was having a nightmare where I think he got his arm caught in his rucksack because he's sleeping on the floor somewhere, and in his dream he said, "Oh, it's all right, I'll just take my arm through a cross-under." A cross-under being a way of connecting two transistors on a ULA. Anyway, so clearly that one got under his skin. Anyway, so the idea of the tube was we could put all these other funny processors on it, and we had this National Semiconductor 16032, which I think was called that because it had a 16-bit bus and a 32-bit instruction, and then they changed it around to be 32016, and then they made another one. Steve Ferber used to call them National Sleazy Conductor. They were definitely the sleazy end of the semiconductor market. We had a whole bunch of people trying to do Z80s and get CPM. Howard Fisher, Simon Woodward, who later popped up in ANT, was doing that. And we had a 6502 running at 4 megahertz, which was really, really great. And that was where I wrote MASM. And so we had the assembler running on the tube, and the macro tables were held in the BBC machine RAM. So it actually was using something in the region of about 80K of RAM to do all this stuff. So that was fun. And there were other things that were added to the toolkit, debuggers and editors. And later on, that assembler turned into the ARM assembler as well. As I said, I was doomed to keep writing better and better versions of the same program. And another one that I did, given that I'd done emulators, was the first ARM emulator. And yes, here's another one with the this was a special tube, special 6502 second processor that Steve Ferber cooked up, and it had 256K of RAM. And yeah, it spotted the IY instructions. So the RAM bus was idle enough, and we could actually get in an extra read. And so you could end up with basically an address for the whole of the 256K of memory, which basically meant whilst you couldn't use the whole of the memory for the program, you could use the spare amount for the data, which is what things like assemblers needed. So I don't think we made an awful lot of those. And I think, if my memory serves me well, and Hugo may remember this as well, we had a guy called Derek Macaulay working on these early on as a student. He later became head of the computer laboratory. Does that ring a bell, Hugh?
That's certainly what happened to Mac. Yes, I shared a house with him for a while in the early 80s. The house that was the same as a logic analyzer, like I mentioned in my talk. As I said, I vaguely remember the words turbo, but I don't remember any of the details about the IY address mode or anything like that. I don't think I ever actually used one of those. Basically, everything I worked on was easy enough to assemble just using an ordinary 6502-second processor.
Yeah. No, I suspect it was probably the Master MOS that was the problem. Because I think we actually had the Master MOS living, and Paul can correct me again, in two 16K ROMs.
Yeah, that's right.
So therefore we had twice as much code, and I think that's why we needed the turbo tube, because we just couldn't assemble it on anything else. It was just,
the operating system had grown quite a bit, and then we added all the graphics stuff that we'd done for the graphics extension ROM into the operating system, and so it filled up two 16K banks quite nicely.
Yeah, with lots of clever code to switch between them, if my memory serves me well as well. Yeah. That was a good one. That I was very fond of that.
There weren't very many of these turbo tubes around.
No, half a dozen, something like that.
Yeah, they were never sold, but it was a very clever idea, and I hope that we don't forget this one, because it just goes to show that with a little bit of clever thinking, you could break the boundaries of how much RAM was available on such a small system.
Yeah,
there's a picture of the board in close up.
Yeah, you can count the RAMs, can't you?
Yeah.
No, Steve Ferber was a very, very clever guy, and he was very, very good at making hardware work as well. I've got a lot of respect for Steve. I believe he's now deputy chairman of the British Computer Society.
Right.
I think.
I don't know.
I think he is. I think he's. Anyway.
Okay,
yeah. So yeah, there was the big financial difficulty. I suspect a lot of that was caused by the fact that we had warehouses full of electrons that we couldn't sell, and in fact, we missed the first Christmas market, and then we lost out on the second one to Alan Sugar, who launched his personal computer, which was in part designed by my old mate Midge, as mentioned originally, and a bunch of other guys who formed a company called Locomotive Software. People might know them. There's a guy called Richard Clayton who's up here in Cambridge now, and in the computer laboratory, and another guy called Chris Hall. They formed Locomotive Software. They did all of Alan Sugar's stuff. So yeah, I can remember electrons. I think they were supposed to sell for £1.99 and being discounted down to something like 80 quid just to move them. Anyway, at the same time, Herman went off to the West Coast, came back with this idea of the reduced instruction set computer. If anybody wants, I can say what a RISC is. It's basically load store architecture, register to register instructions, no specialized registers, so complete opposite of an x86 where every register is special. And you could typically make them with a very low transistor count. Some people sort of use this to put in all sorts of other things, like the infamous Spark register Windows stuff, which in my opinion was an own goal. People like MIPS did fantastic things with them. Anyway, Herman came back with this idea, and we'd always been unhappy with the enormous latency of the kind of processors that we could get other than a 6502. 32016 was crap, 68000s were crap. We wanted something with an instruction latency of, a couple of microseconds. An interrupt latency of a couple of microseconds. And Steve and Roger realized they could just make something that did this. And Yeah, back to writing emulators again. So that was an instruction level emulator. Steve, I believe, wrote almost, if not a gate level emulator, a block level emulator, and that used to run at about 3 cycles per second. So it wasn't much good for running code on. Mine ran at about a couple of thousand instructions per second, maybe, something like that. And Roger wrote one on this 32016, and on top of that, he then implemented an editor, and we could use it. It was it worked really well, which was amazing. Anyway, the first ARM came back with funny lockups and things like that. But it was a proof of concept. We realised we could actually make something like that. And the second one came back, and it actually worked. ARM 2. And ARM 3 came along a bit later, and that was kind of the last one that Acorn made, because after that ARM was spun out. I think that's probably it. Yeah, so having got this fabulous processor, we then immediately abandoned the things we were good at, which is making educational machines with small operating systems, and instead, much like lots of other people, got this idea we could make something that would rival the Mac and Lisa. Don't know if anybody remembers a Lisa, but this was an enormous machine that was going to be the sort of Apple business machine. And in fact, we had a Lisa. We went and got one. Dave Lampkin and I went to somewhere or other in my car and collected one. But that was one that never really worked. But Apple, having vast amounts of money as they did, basically ran a second program in-house to produce a kind of cut-down cheapy machine, and that was the Mac. And that was incredibly successful. Anyway, we thought we were going to do that, and we started producing this thing in ARCs. We employed a whole bunch of people in the United States, which, as already mentioned, never works. And we had to write this stuff in Modular 2 Plus, which is one of Nichols Wirth's or Niklaus Wirth's, depending on whether you call him by name or by value, languages. And various of us worked on that. Hugo worked on it. David Steele worked on it. A lot of the people who went to ARM worked on it, people like Lee Smith, Harry Meekings. But eventually it was realised it was going to be far too late, far too big, far too slow, and probably never be finished at all. And all of a sudden, a whole bunch of people, formerly Acorn Soft, people like Stuart, people like Neil Rain, probably Tim, probably even Hugo as well, suddenly realised they could kind of make a BBC MOS and call it Riscos. And that's how it happened. And I worked a bit on this. I worked on this thing called a task window, which was to go in an editor that had been built by William Stoy. It's a bit like an Emacs shell buffer, but a lot rougher at the edges. I did a whole load of other work on Unix as well. But this is kind of wandering off at this point. Yeah, so we're into the funny anecdotes now. I dare say most people have heard of Stephen Hawking one way or another, probably for the sort of British Telecom adverts he did, with the artificial voice box that he had. Just keep talking kind of stuff. Anyway, Herman was, I think, very keen to keep good relations with people in the academic part of Cambridge, and the Applied Maths Department was one of them, and I think it's probably Stephen Hawking's secretary who also pushed this. Anyway, he came for a visit, and as I've mentioned in here, he arrived in his wheelchair, and anybody who's seen somebody who's got motor neurone disease, knows what they look like. I mean, Stephen's actually looking pretty good there. This is early in his life. He looked a lot worse later when he couldn't even hold his head up. And some of you might even have seen a television program recently about a guy called Peter who had the same disease and has now basically been given an artificial exoskeleton in which he can stand up. And he's got an artificial voice box as well. Anyway, digress. But the funniest thing, actually, as I say, was seeing Stephen Hawking just picked up like a sack of potatoes by his 2 sons and carried up these very steep stairs so that he could see what went on the top floor, which is where all us software gurus worked. We all had our own little offices up there with metal walls. As I say, it was a bit like being in a Frost Tunnel ferry. How he got up, I don't know. Yes, so when I first went to Acorn, poor old Paul Bond, he got ingrowing toenails. And I do remember him sitting there with his feet in salt baths for a lot of the day. It must have been incredibly painful. Anyway, and he always wore open-toed sandals because he couldn't bear to have his feet enclosed in shoes, which was a golden opportunity for me to step on one of them. I'm not sure whether that made me something to be feared or quite what, but anyway, we got on okay in the end, but it was tough. And this is just one of those things I remember. I hope Hugo remembers this as well. So, we learned all about critical regions. We learned about semaphores and all these kinds of things. And it turned out some of our hardware had similar problems. And one of the things was the disk controller, which it basically, after a while, it would unload the head, because otherwise you'd basically wear the disks out. And if you issued it a command in about the 5 milliseconds before it was doing that, which was basically, I assume, the point at which it started to go through some part of its finite state machine to say unload the head, it would accept the command quite happily, then unload the head, and of course then the command would never happen, and consequently it was then locked. And basically you could work around this in software if you knew about it. And about the same time, see Squirrel later, we were having a lot of trouble with firstly the Squirrel people who basically copied things, but one of the things we wanted to get them for was copying DFS as well, and we had to prove that other people had copied it. And so we made a program. We went to an exhibition looking for people who got this bug, which typically meant they'd copied our code. Quite a number of them had, and clearly quite a number of them had not, and they, the code just behaved completely differently for them. I don't know, do you remember any more about this, Hugh?
Honestly, I don't really remember that bug. I suspect that was one of the easy ones compared to disk fault 18, which is the one that's lodged in my mind that I talked about quite a lot earlier. That one I'm not so sure about, but yeah, I mean, I believe you. Yeah. There was lots of things like that where there's a general principle I realised dealing with that, and also dealing with the very helpful hard disk controller. You end up writing in software an almost complete emulation of the chip you're trying to control, because that's the only way you can guess what the damn thing is trying to do if you tweak it in just the wrong manner. And it's also so often we were punished for writing quick, efficient code that would actually go command, 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 where the spec says it can do that, but no, you're advised to wait at least 10 milliseconds before looking at the status register, because yeah, you're always having to just put in delays to make sure the thing has settled down, or even go, well, I gave it a command as it started. No. Oh, well, give it the command again. Here we go.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that I don't remember, but I remember that just generally being a property of chips and controllers at the time, where we wrote tight, fast code on a quite fast for the time 6502 at, as you say, all of 2 megahertz. But most of them were probably used to being bothered at 100 kilohertz, maybe, or, much, much slower. So, yeah, fun times, eh?
Yeah, no, there were many fun times. This was probably one of the most amusing. So the educational market was very important for Acorn, and I'm sure Brian must have talked about this because he originally came from Bowson. Anyway, they weren't allowed to specify what they wanted, but they were allowed, as in, I want one of these. They were allowed to say it must do this and this and this and this and this. And eventually that was enough for some bright sparks to decide, well, we'll just make a machine that does this and this and this and this and this. We'll just make a copy, really, except it will be ours, we'll take the profits. And obviously that was going to cut Barson out of the educational market in West Australia in this particular case. Barson, I think, was actually in Melbourne, but sold to the whole of Australia. I didn't realise how big Australia was till I went there. It's 3 time zones wide. It takes about 4 hours in an aeroplane to travel from Perth to Melbourne. It's a big country. Anyway, having got wind of this, Barson immediately sort of filed lawsuits and injunctions and God knows what else. And I think managed to get a hold on this thing. And amazingly enough, was able to convince the judicial process that someone from Acorn would be able to come along and say whether this was a copy. Now, I would have thought that would have involved, you know, some amount of bias, because obviously someone from Acorn could come along and say it was a copy even if it wasn't. Anyway, so I remember one day Roger talking to me and he said, "We've got this problem. Do you think you could go to Australia for a month?" What? Anyway, this was in October 1987, which is a date that will probably stick in most people's minds. So I got the visas and everything else, and got packed up, and got on a Boeing 747, I think, and basically travelled for 24 hours. And I was unbelievably knackered. You know, I'd been to San Francisco. That's a long way. I was seriously knackered then, but that was partly because I'd stayed up the night before to try and get a standby ticket. Anyway, so I got met by sort of Barson's representative, who they'd also sent to Perth, who took me to my hotel, where I then sort of slept like a zombie for however long, and then had to get up and go to the offices of the Squirrel Company. I don't even know what they were called. With the express purpose of proving that these people were liars and cheats, which I can tell you is not a pleasant position to be in when you're sitting in someone else's office all day, asking them to be cooperative to you and all the rest of it, whilst at the same time trying to say, and by the way, guys, you're a bunch of cheats. In the middle of the afternoon, as I said, you know, the jet lag was it, and I was just out. Of course, the guy who was in charge said, "Oh, you can come back tomorrow." But then come tomorrow, he said, "Oh, no, you can't come back. No, can't be done. And so, of course, you know, the first thing was lawyers go in front of judges and must have more access. You know, poor guy who's completely exhausted, not surprisingly, come from England the night before. So I got more access, and you know, the more I looked at it, the more I realised that basically they'd attempted to rewrite the BBC MOS. They'd got a number of things wrong. One of the things I noticed was they'd completely copied the sideways ROM access mechanism, which is it's a really weird piece of stack juggling code to basically switch ROMs. So I went back to my hotel room and I wrote a completely different version of it just to prove it could be done. And they of course had copied ours. The other thing that they'd done was they'd taken the memory initialization routine. Now, we used to write an RTI instruction into the first byte of every 256 byte page in case we got random NMIs we weren't expecting, and it would just return. They didn't realize what this was for, so they changed the memory initialization routine. So instead of not stepping on this NMI that we put there, they just scribbled all over them. So it was quite clear to me that they had copied the MOS and hadn't known what they were doing. The trouble with this was, you try to explain that to a judge. Now, we were lucky. We got the judge who had already done a copyright infringement case involving Apple. So he wasn't a complete thicko, but nevertheless, you know, this is a man who was eminently legal, but computer scientifically a noddy. And basically, we had to convince this judge, as much as anything, on the quality and strength of personality that we were right and the other side were wrong. Anyway, while all that was going on, as I said, I managed to get a visit to a school where there was a squirrel. This is the name of the machine. And I discovered that they just stuck BBC Basic in it. They basically bought a BBC Basic ROM and stuck it in there. Which you just cannot do. You know, you're basically using a piece of your competitor's equipment to promote your own competitive thing. Anyway, that basically put a complete hold on them. You know, they couldn't go ahead and develop. Anyway, apart from that, had a lot of fun. Did some light aircraft flying and bought a camera to record my exploits. And eventually we moved off to Sydney. The middle of, I mean, Sydney's a huge city and it's got some fabulous parts, you know, like like the harbour and the Opera House and all the rest of it, and even where I stayed, which is called Rushcutters Bay. Brian might know that, I don't know. But the centre of it is a bit like central London. It's got these tiny little streets which wind all over the place and change names on a regular basis. Anyway, we won the case, and then, funnily enough, Squirrel had no money because, of course, the money to pay them was being drip fed in by Southern Tech. So they never had a bank account with more than about threepence. Anyway, then I went off to Melbourne, stayed with a local guy, and I gave the first public lecture on ARM in a university class. That went down really, really well, actually. It was really quite nice to talk about what we were doing, and at the end of it, being able to say, and we made it work. Also, I got told there'd been a hurricane in England, which I thought, yeah, that'd be ridiculous. We don't have hurricanes in England. This is the Michael Fish hurricane, even though he denies, he said there wouldn't be a hurricane. And when I came back, I got to visit places like One Oaks, which had been, and places in Dorking where just basically every tree had been uprooted. And I bumped into a couple of guys called the Cambridge Buskers who were old college mates of mine, halfway around the world. It's amazing. You might have seen them on TV, actually. I think that's probably that. Oh, yes. And the last funny one. Yeah, used to work on Saturdays quite often, did all sorts of things. I mean, part of this was, doing my own stuff, like porting the adventure games. We actually ported quite a number of them from the 370 system, where they were originally written, to the shovel and spade system, as we called it. And I tipped my coffee in the BBC machine one day, which of course stopped it dead in its tracks. And I realised I'd blown a circuit breaker halfway across the building. Anyway, after that was all reset, I was able to power it up again with a local circuit breaker. It was entirely unharmed. These were seriously robust machines, unlike the time for giving back machines, which I might have mentioned later. Probably another slide, Paul.
That was the end.
Did I mention the time for giving back, or did anybody else mention that?
The what, sorry?
Time for giving back. So Acorn, inspired by Chris Curry, put an advert in one of the papers. I'm not sure if it's a local or a national, basically saying sometimes Christmas is the time for giving back. And this was a sideswipe at the appalling reliability of the Sinclair Spectrums. Anyway, Curry, being a man who was much given to drinking, was encountered by Clive Sinclair in, I think, the Baron of Beef, or possibly the Mitre, one of those two pubs in Cambridge anyway, who came along waving a newspaper in his face and trying to bash him over the head, and it ended up with a bit of fisticuffs over this article. And then Chris Curry gave us a great talk about it in one of our Christmas parties shortly afterwards. Anyway, I think that's the end of my time at Acorn. I don't know whether you want to go on with what I did after my time at Acorn, or whether people want to ask questions.
I think we probably better go over to questions, actually, John. This is why I stopped the slide at that convenient break point.
Yeah, okay.
Because I think there's been quite a large number of requests for questions. So,
okay, I have to say, seeing some of the questions, a lot of the decisions that people were asking about were actually taken before I joined Acorn. Almost certainly they were taken by the likes of Paul and Roger. So, why did they have this ahead of its time interface to the OS? Well, I suspect that interface existed in things like System 3. I'm pretty sure it did, probably in the Atom. And it was just basically good computer science.
I'd agree with that, for what it's worth. Just having vectors rather than fixed addresses, it's the obvious way to do it. And yeah, generic interfaces like Osbyte, we all like Osbyting, don't we? Generic interfaces like that, it's just the right way to do it. You make it as general as possible, but rather than having fixed addresses and places to peek and poke. Yeah, it's good computer science, as you say.
Well, I do have a question that's come in from Ed. He says, first of all, great talk, John. That he's very interested in the 256K second processor and didn't recognize the photo. And he's wondering if there's any photographs of that machine we might not have, or any if anybody actually has that version of the 6502 with the extended second processor, or something that would help them to do the emulation.
I don't have one of those. I gave all of my BBC computer stuff either to the Cambridge Computer Preservation Society or something like that, probably about 20 years ago. So I don't have any of those. But I think the main part of the logic that you need to get right is this business of fetching the third byte of the address, which would be the highest byte, for which you only care about 2 bits if you're going to do 256K. If you want to do bigger, you can use more bits. I don't think Steve's solution was in any way restricted to just 2 bits.
Oh, okay. And there was another question from Ed asking about the 6502 emulation of the ARM. Just wondering if the source code survived or the binary, or if there's any signs of that still in existence.
It's not impossible that I got it from the stuff that Paul Middleton managed to rescue off my A500s, which I gave him. So Paul Middleton's Simon Middleton's brother. He's the guy who bought the rights to Riscos and runs Riscos Limited. I think if anybody's got that code, he'd be a good guy to ask.
Okay. Perfect.
It's not impossible that I got it. I just haven't had a look. The things I was interested in getting off those things were the adventure games, because I was interested in making those work again, and they, of course, were my personal property rather than Acorn.
Okay. So let me just have a quick look on the forum and pull one of the other. There's a question here asking who designed the BBC Micro character set in the operating system, as it's very distinctive and different from the other home computers. So
yeah, I did attempt to answer that one when I saw it on Stardot. I don't know the full answer. The Mode 7 character set was what was built into the teletext chip. So rather than being a bitmapped setup, unlike all the other modes, it was actually, you just had to write a byte into the right place. And that's one of the reasons, in fact, why when we wrote the adventure games, we used Mode 7. It would allow us to do these funny split screens, and it also used the minimum amount of display memory, meaning that we could have the maximum amount for basically caching blocks off the floppy disk, because none of the adventures fitted in memory. I don't know who did the other work. Almost certainly that preceded my time.
I think the BBC had a hand in designing some of the goals of that character set, like having double width verticals. So it's in mode 0, which is the 80-column mode, you'd be okay on TVs and stuff. Because otherwise, if you get too narrow, it would sort of look
you
like
get aliasing, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Use readers' ties and things.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did get some of that anyway.
But I can't remember who actually designed the actual characters. Apart from that,
no. I mean, I think if anybody can find Graham Tebby, he might be somebody worth asking. But I haven't heard from him. Well, for 40 years, I guess. Not a long time. 30
blink of an eye.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well,
because he was at PI Research doing the race car engine controller stuff.
Oh, right.
In the 90s, and I don't know whether he's still associated with what is now part of Cosworth, but
yeah. It's possible that information got passed through to David Seal, because he took over all the graphics stuff. Graphics was never my thing, and still isn't.
No problem. So a little bit of a lighter question, if you like. Archie 456 is asking this, and he says, what do you think of the other 8-bit machines that were around at the time? Was there anything that you thought they did better, or how did you think that Acorn actually compared to them from a software perspective? Would you have done anything different in the OS?
I think the answer to that question is no. I don't think we ever saw anything that we thought was better than what we had. We saw an awful lot of things that we thought were much worse. Typically the Sinclair machines, they were a kind of standing joke as far as we were concerned. In fact, Steve Furber used to refer to the Spectrum as the rectum, for example. you could see how much regard we had for simpler stuff. The other ones, you know, dragons and things like that, I don't remember us ever thinking, oh, I wish we'd done that. No, I don't think there was ever any of that.
So kind of leading on from that, it comes from Toby Lobster is his username, nice username. He's asking, what features would you liked to have included but didn't have the space or time? What was the one that got away?
Yeah, well, I mean, we as I mentioned, we were always compressing that code so we could get more things in. I suspect what would have got added in if we'd had more space would probably have been more graphics, at a guess.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, of course, what happened when we made the master. Lots more graphics got added in. I can't particularly think of anything else where we'd have said, yeah, we're really missing that.
Okay.
Can I just comment just one thing?
Yeah.
I totally agree with all of that. I mean, you know, the Beeb had triangles because triangles is the most basic thing you can break shapes into. There's nothing simpler than a triangle for breaking a shape down, right? And with triangles, you can build anything else. I was never that involved in game writing, obviously, but one thing that I recall people complaining about is that they wish the various Beeb versions of stuff had at least a handful of hardware sprites in the graphics, which it never ever did because we did everything in software. And that was something that games writers wanted and were frustrated by because it meant they had to write more code to do the equivalent of hardware sprites. But yeah, we never did any of that, did we? If I remember rightly.
I don't think we did.
Could have feed all over your disk buffers even better then, couldn't they, if you'd had those?
Yes, exactly.
Like the cursor.
Oh yeah, well, go away. Yes, you've got to mention there, John, for mentioning at 4 in the morning in Top Express above La Margarita that the cursor was a software cursor on the Electron, and you know, do you remember that? It was you that told me that the cursor's done in software and it dicks with the screen memory, and that's why Star Compact went bad on the Electron.
Vaguely believe that.
Yeah, well, it was you that pointed this out to me. As I say, after we'd spent ages going over the code, going, it's all the same. It can't possibly be different. How can it go wrong?
The Beeb did have a hardware cursor.
That's right.
The only thing it had, and the Electron, yeah, it was just XOR stuff.
That's right. So it buggered up my memory, indeed.
Yeah.
But yes, that's it. The Beeb only ever had a hardware cursor, and that's all it did. And there was quite a few people saying, we want sprites to do animations in games, because a lot of the competing machines had that. But that's not something that we wanted, because, you know, it's something that games writers wanted.
So one other question. There's a lot of questions actually from Big Ed, but I'm going to pick one off the forum. He asks, were there any considerations from the second processor and the tube which drove decisions in the architecture of the operating system?
I think, to be honest, not really. I don't think we had anything.
There's things like having the top 16 bits being set to access IO processor when doing star loads and things like that. It had, you know, if you did star load to FFFF 2000, it would load to the IO processor and the main Beeb, and if it didn't, then it would load to the coprocessor.
I've completely forgotten that.
Tim. You're right, Tim. But though that was stuff that filing systems implemented as much as the MOS. I mean, the MOS had the cassette stuff in it only, didn't it? In terms of the global memory map, the BBC machine itself was at the very top page, and the second processor was down at the very bottom there. And yeah, there was OS support for that, in that there were routines you had to tell the second processor where you wanted stuff to be put, and therefore the MOS did some comms over the tube to tell the second processor to get ready to receive data pushed through one of those tube FIFOs. So there was some routines to support it. Otherwise, we could never have got data in and out of the second processor. But it wasn't really architecturally influential, shall we say, other than, again, that insistence to do everything correctly via calls to vectors rather than peeks and pokes and fixed addresses. Because obviously the environment for running an assembly program on the second processor, 6502, was the same as running it on the Beeb. It's just that there was a lot more memory, but all the OS interface was exactly the same. That was the fundamental point of it.
So I have one question from Jonathan Halston. I'm going to have to do this one a little bit verbatim. The initial MOS 0.1 code is dealing with sideways ROMs. It sort of looks like it was expected or planned to select ROMs via their ROM title, and the ROM header would then be a list of commands. So the MOS would take, for example, *basic, scan the ROMs, and then look for a ROM with basic, and then and 00 in the header and select it. Is that theory correct, he asks?
If it is, I have no recollection of it, is all I can say. God's teeth.
It was a rather complicated question.
Yeah, no, I follow what he's saying. I just don't think I cannot remember us having done that. To be honest, when I joined Acorn, MOS 0.1 was already effectively history. You know, we were working on making 1.0 at that stage. There was no way we were going to kind of make a bug fix 0.1. It was just 1.0 was it. That was the only game in town. And I think, as far as I remember, pretty early on, we abandoned the Model A as well.
Whose idea was it to use star, as in the star commands? And who decided Stardot would be kind of the default?
I can't tell you who thought of star. My suspicion is this predates the Beeb. Anybody remember what commands were on Atoms, for example?
The same, but it's worth pointing out that the fact that star makes it be an OS command rather than something to the basic ROM or Lisp ROM or whatever your language ROM of the moment is up to the language ROM, okay? Yes. Now, the thing is that there had also been on some of the systems machines, I think, if you like, a pure OS without a language, where the prompt was a star. So people were used to it just being, if you didn't have a language, you'd get a star and that was the prompt. And the only thing you could type in was OS commands. So it kind of felt natural that it was star this or star that to do the OS. And that convention was carried into the language ROMs. And the reason that Stardot was catalog or cat is just that it's the first one in the list.
Yeah,
that,
dot was just abbreviation.
Yeah.
So first one that matched, and that was it.
So the first one that matched an empty string is the first one in the list, which was always cat.
Perfect. Well, I think all that remains is just to say thank you very much for your time, John, and really, really interesting to hear the first-hand recounts, and also to Paul for the support, and Hugo as well for the backup.
Yeah, big thanks to Paul for putting the slides together. I am completely and utterly useless at anything to do with PowerPoint, and deliberately so to some extent. Somebody put a question in there about the adventure stuff, so I can certainly answer that if you want. I can't remember what it was.
Well, that was Kevin Edwards asked about Atchison. Yeah, let me find that question. Hold on.
While you're doing that, I was just going to reminisce with John again, because our paths crossed once again later on. John became CTO at a company doing browsers for embedded systems, and particularly for set-top boxes, called Ant, that was started by the Van Sommeren brothers and David Boris, as we all know him. And so John was working on software there for the browser that we put in these boxes that I talked to you about before, that run that BBC operating system underneath. So once again, these paths that we've all taken, both sort of after Acorn, have recrossed so many more times in different aspects. It's been amazing. I mean, Hugo and John, you both worked at Harlequin, for example, didn't you?
We both worked at Harlequin. We both worked at CSR.
Yeah.
Indeed, that's all true.
Yeah. Yeah, Hugo went to Harlequin before I did.
But all that stuff was pointless, so we haven't mentioned it.
Oh, do I win the prize then for being pointless?
No, the stuff at Harlequin and CSR was all pointless, is what I meant.
In comparison to ARM and the way that's taken over the world of embedded devices, yeah, I agree.
That's the whole of my point, yes. Yeah.
CSR owned most of the world of Bluetooth, actually. Wasn't that pointless. Harlequin, I would absolutely agree. Didn't own the world of anything. It paid me to have a good time and travel around the world a bit. You know, if you want to talk about pointless, you should look at the stuff I do with big matrices. That earns me nothing at all other than a lot of satisfaction.
Yeah, that looks pretty scary, John.
So what are you doing now, John?
CSR, I went to work for a company called Ubinetics, who were basically making protocol stacks for mobile phones. They were then bought by CSR, who thought they could make mobile phones, or at least mobile phone chips, and hadn't realized that, you know, one of the reasons Qualcomm had to be as big as it was the R&D cost of making something like that was enormous. So they bought Ubinetics and me with it. And of course, we weren't going to tell them that they wasted their time. So I worked for them for a while. And then about 5 years ago, CSR was actually bought by Qualcomm. So I now work for Qualcomm. And basically, I spend most of my day working with, got the video on me, boards like this, which is a test board for the kind of thing you might find in a soundbar or an earbud. And the bit that I do is the low power mode, which is making the darn thing run on a power consumption of about a few tens of microamps. So not that far above the leakage current of the battery. And that's what I'm doing, and they still pay me loads of money, and I'm working from home doing it. I still quite enjoy it. And then I spend loads of time bashing very enormous matrices to do maths research, where enormous now means several million square. And yes, they do take up terabytes of space. And I do a bit of astronomy, and re-encountered Paul again, who recommended me a telescope, which I very much enjoy using.
Splendid.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I looked at the rings of Saturn through it the other day. It's so much better than looking in a book.
It's somehow real, isn't it, John?
It makes it real, and it just makes it 10, 100 times better than anything you can see in a book. You think, I'm looking at that, it's that thing up there, and there you are, look, there's rings. Bloody hell. I tried to show it to my granddaughters, but unfortunately the weather was crap for the entire week they were here.
Okay, I've located the adventures question, John. I'll ask his question in two parts, and the second part is, have you heard of an adventure called Search for the Lost Orb, author unknown at present, possibly by someone at Acorn or Acornsoft? Kevin had a lot of developer discs from various authors over the years, and he found this. He didn't know much about it.
He's going to be disappointed because I don't either.
Well, it was worth a shot because it was a very well-written adventure. It looked like it could have been Acornsoft standard. The first half of the question, John, please tell us about the history of Atchison and what inspired you to write it. Did you write any other adventures that possibly didn't see the light of day?
Okay, well, so some of the history I've covered. As I said, I encountered Colossal Cave when I was at university doing my PhD, and having finished that and talked a lot to David Seal, who did the graphics and was then one of the founding members of Arm, we decided we would write a game of our own. And initially, I think we had ideas for how it would be implemented, and the idea was you would have a database, which was effectively a binary to be interpreted. You would have a compiler, which would take text and turn that into the binary database, and you would have a player that would interpret the database. And David wrote the interpreter, and I wrote the compiler. Back to my usual standard of writing assemblers. And then really we just started off with I don't know where we got the exact ideas for the things we put into it, but it was very much, you know, inspired by and in homage to Colossal Cave. We wrote a first version of it, which was made available on the IBM 370 that we had available to us, which was later replaced by a 3081 and then a 3084, but it was very similar. And then Jonathan Partington joined our team. Jonathan was another one of the D&D crowd, in fact, same crowd that David was involved with. And he enabled us to sort of write a large extension to it. And I think that's where things like the Wizards area and what have you appeared. Whereas the original game had things like the Desert Canyon the pirates. And I think the new version might have had the lower levels of the mine as well, because the initial version just had the mine where you could basically say a magic word and out would pop something from the mine. You know, what was the pickaxe for? Except the magic word was execute. And a lot of people wrote games for that system. Peter Kilworth wrote a game called Brand X. That later became Philosopher's Quest. Rod Underwood wrote a game called Quandam. That was later published by Acorn Soft as well. Jonathan Partington wrote Hamel. He wrote Murdoch. He and I, later on, for the new system, wrote Spy Snatcher. That wasn't published by Acorn Soft. It was published by Topologica. But numerous other games either started life on the IBM 370 or started life on our new revised system, where we wrote the first one was kind of like a bit like an autocode with skip instructions and things like that, whereas the later one was much more like a sort of very basic algol like language with, you know, sort of if then else's and loops and what have you, but again with a sort of interpreter and compiler type of approach to these. We had a lot of fun doing those things. I think that's about as much information as I can provide. We did start writing another one, which not only didn't see the light of day, it didn't even get beyond the planning stage. And we had a lot of ideas for that, but they never really got into anything. You know, and the Acorn market folded, and the Topologica market they never managed to sell enough to make it worth spending more time on them. Unfortunately, even when we managed to sell them on IBM PCs and PCWs and CPCs and whatever, the Amstrad things. That answer the question? Probably.
Well, you've got to say what Spade and Shovel stood for.
Well, yeah, we did try and give acronyms for these, and yes, Spade was Structured Programming Aid for Dungeon Excavation, and Shovel was Structured Handling of Versatile Explorations Language. So there you go.
Fabulously contrived.
Yeah, absolutely. I dare say people probably remember playing some of these games in-house while I was trying to and pointing out to me bugs like the room with the purple star and things like that. Yeah.
Thanks again, guys. Really, really great to hear that. I just want to say just a quick extra message. I was asked to remind everybody every now and again. Above my head, you can see there's a URL for donating to the Centre for Computing History. If any of you guys can find it in your hearts or pockets to do so, they need your help desperately.